Greetings, viewers. So just as a follow-up to our previous video on Brexit and the geopolitics of British decline. So we ended last video focusing on the period 1945 to roughly 1973. Now something interesting happens in 1973. Britain decides to join the European Union. And you can read the article in depth and it lays out the arguments in greater detail, but the basic point is this. The other European countries, they lose their empires. They join Europe in 1973, and they see the European Union as a community of equals. We're all in this together. We're all societies that had empires, had to give them up, and now we need to reinvent ourselves as some form of functional social democracies. That was the consensus amongst the rest of Europe, not for the British. The British elites joined the European Union in the vain hope that the Union is a community of empires, not equals, empires. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of history. And again, this is where the deep history of 100 years of British hegemony and then 30 years of essentially trying to maintain British primacy, 130 years of social history, and then the post-war period of trying to tail after the American empire, trying to be, essentially the British wave is the British trying to be more American than the Americans themselves, and succeeding in part because there's a flexibility that you can reinvent yourself and take on these forms and export that as kind of a mixture of Anglo-America. But that doesn't change the fact that you're not really that. Britain can't really be America because it can't duplicate the things that make America actually a superpower. It's public services, it's New Deal, it's industrial muscle, and all these things. So between 1973 and 1979, the British wave ends, and we have this very interesting moment of crisis, which is incredibly productive from a cultural standpoint. In fact, some of the most amazing music culture comes out of Britain at this point. You have to think of the immense impact. The two landmarks there, of course, are Pink Floyd, so the great four albums, which bracket this point between 1973 and 1979, their four greatest albums, each one a kind of a window, a seismograph into the contradictions of that time. And they get increasingly gloomy as well. And they're a little hopeful at the beginning, and then less hopeful, and then grim, and then with The Wall of 1979, it's just complete breakdown. You get there's an end of an era, end of a time period happening there, and an immense mourning process which kicks in. And the other great musical document of this era is the invention of punk rock. And this is working class resistance with a direct anti-imperial message. Famous example, the Sex Pistols, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, which is a fantastic work of music and one of the great works of late 20th century sonic acoustic media production. But also something of an anomaly because it's already outside of that British wave. It's not really part of the British wave anymore. It's sort of a transnational reaction against that, against the attempt at creating some mythical empire that'll just keep on being empire, and it rejects that. And that's that musical energy and tension. So it's unique and it's unrepeatable, and it can only go so far, and this time period has to come to an end. British elites have a fateful meeting of the ways in 1979. They have to make a decision. Do we double down on Europe and become an actual social democracy, which would mean giving up power and empowering the British working class and changing the culture in fundamental ways that for 130 years, up until 1945, they didn't want to change, and then 45 to 73, they only changed in terms of certain media franchises, but everything else stayed the same. So real change is threatening the British elites. What do? They install Thatcherism. And they convince people to go along with Thatcherism. And Thatcherism, and to make a long story short, Thatcherism is sort of Britain's attempt to not just mimic the American empire in terms of media, it's also an attempt to mimic the American empire's economic strategy. So the American empire, those of you who have read Yanis Varoufakis, his point is there have been two periods to the American empire, 1945-1973, the global plan, and then 1973 to 2008, the global minotaur. The first is direct administration of empire, industrial muscle. The second is financialization. So Britain adopts an American strategy of financialization, and whereas the United States adopts what Varoufakis calls the global minotaur, so this mythical beast of current account deficits, trade deficits, but rules through finance, Britain comes up with a smaller version of that. So I call the smaller version not the global minotaur, but the mini-taur, M-I-N-I. So the miniature version of the minotaur, which ran the planet, but the mini tour just ran Britain and tried to do certain speculative things. The agenda is the same. You crush working class wages, you enrich plutocrats and elites at the top, you rip apart the welfare state, you concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, and somehow this is supposed to result in prosperity. Now, this strategy failed miserably. And when you look at the economic data, every year since 1979, the British decline has accelerated. It's quite extraordinary. Britain, as a society, the rates of investment in the British economy, they're around 21, 22% in the 70s. Then they dropped to 19% in the 1980s. They continue to drop in the 1990s, when again, the politics of mini-tour are still being pursued. Whatever government is in power in Britain, they're pursuing the same policy of finance first, people second. Investment comes down to about 18%. After 2000, investment comes down to 18.5%, 17%. And of course, since the financial crisis in 2008, where the global mini-tour dies, but the mini-tour also goes into cardiac arrest and perishes, rates of investment in Britain have been down to around 16.5% to 17%. Now, this is the terminal level because 15% means replacement. So if your society is just barely investing in stuff to keep up the economy and nothing more, then you're losing ground and competitiveness against other nations at a very rapid clip. The other countries of the European Union invest between 21 to 22% of their GDP. But Britain has consistently failed to invest in anything associated with its own economy because of this mini-tour economic model. And this has come with a terrible price tag. And one of the price tags, in addition to terrible austerity, the breakout of horrible racism, a war of all against all, as people try to scramble for the little bit of money that they have, it's destroyed everything interesting about British culture. You have to think of the productivity of the new wave between 1945 and 1973. Britain's producing all this amazing stuff, just leading the world in terms of fashion and stories and narratives and franchises. What does Britain produce after 1979? Not a heck of a lot. And the one exception, by the way, proves the rule. There's one shining exception people will trot out and to say that, oh, no, see, Britain is still dynamic. And there's a terrible irony here. And that's, of course, Harry Potter. And the great irony is that J.K. Rowling, the creator of Harry Potter, is Scotch. It's a Scottish franchise, and it's fundamentally about the project of an independent Scotland. It has very little to do with Britain. Britain's sort of the other, the outside, but the narrative locus of the Harry Potter series is actually this strange, inchoate vision of Scottish nationhood as driving it. It's tenuous, it's limited, the allegory is incomplete, but it's actually not a document of any kind of successful British culture. It's a very successful document of what I think will happen in a couple of years, and that is an independent Scotland. The chances are very high Britain turns into the four nations that it's comprised of: England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And of course, Scotland is the furthest down the road because they clearly see that we need to stay in the European Union. There's no future outside of that. We'll just end up as a failed state. Many countries have stayed outside. It's not going to work. We need to stay in the European Union. That's best for us, and will safeguard our economy. So the breakup of Britain is almost a certainty unless some massive political transformation happens and some progressive majority comes to power. It's almost certain because these are the long-term legacies. Britain never dealt with its history of empire, and it's kind of very sad and sort of fitting, ironic an end of the British Empire that would sort of end that way. It was the last society to decolonize, and now finally it pays the price for not acknowledging history. There are important lessons for the world, and there are really important lessons for the United States, my country, and the ways that we're not dealing with the lessons of empire and its legacies. But that's a subject for another podcast.